Hey everyone, welcome to session 212 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. I've got a really fun episode to share with you. My guest today is Dr. Tim Hackenberg, and he joined me to discuss both what we know and what we don't know about token economies. This conversation was inspired by my recent interview with Dr. Matt Brodhead. That was way back in session 205. And wherein listening to the show, Tim picked up on a misstatement of mine. We get into the specifics of the exact statement in our interview, but in brief, I made an off-the-cuff comment about token economy research, and thankfully, Tim reached out to me and offered to discuss this issue in more detail, and more importantly, correct my point of view on this matter. And I'm so glad he did just that. I really learned a lot in this episode. In it, we discussed the basics of what constitutes a token economy, the importance of generalized reinforcers, early research in this area, how to troubleshoot ineffective token economies, and perhaps most interestingly, directions for future research. And spoiler alert, there's a lot we don't know about this stuff. So even if you've been around the token economy world for a while, I think there's a lot in here for just about anybody. And our discussion, it's centered around Tim's 2018 Java paper, Token Reinforcement, Translational Research and Application. And as I mentioned in the interview, it's really just an impressive work of scholarship, and I highly recommend taking the time to read through it in its entirety. Make notes, go just, really wade into it. Set aside some time to do so. It'll be well worth it. So again, whether you're a newly minted BCBA or a seasoned pro, I think there's something here for everyone. Tim also shared that he, along with Dr. Francesca Deli Espinoza, created 2 token economy courses. One is a brief overview that's free, and there's a more advanced course called Token Economies, Bridging the Gap from Research to Practice. So if you want to get links to that, just go to the show notes for this episode. That's over at behavioralobservations.com and look for session 212. This podcast is brought to you today by the University of Cincinnati Online. UC Online designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis program that's 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log on when it works for you. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the Request Info button. We're also brought to you by Rose Griffin's free masterclass, The Power of Joint Attention. This 30-minute class will show you how to use books in therapy, so your students are running over to you to listen to you read. The course also covers how to use songs in therapy so that your learners are eager to participate and play and are ready to engage with you every session. Rose shares actionable tips that you can use in your next therapy session and provides bonus printables that you can use in your practice right away. To learn more, go to abaspeech.org and click the free masterclass tab at the top of the page. Last but not least, we're brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn about their CEU offerings, including their 8-hour supervision course, as well as RBT trainings over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. All right, that's it for opening remarks. Without any further delay, let's get to this really fun and informative conversation with Dr. Tim Hackenberg.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Tim Hackenberg, welcome to the Behavioral Observations podcast. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a funny story about how this came to be, actually, and I'd like to kind of set this up, and then we can get into some formal questions for the interview. But just to clue in the listeners, I think it was session 205. I had a conversation with my friend Dr. Matt Brodhead, and we talked about various aspects of the ethics of punishment. And not to anyone's surprise, I got a little bit of feedback on that, more so than most shows that I put out there, and all of it very I got some really nice comments on it. And then I got an email from you that was like, "Hey, you mentioned token economies," and I think I made some sort of flippant comment about, hey, I think we know all there is to know about token economies, and it was just totally off the cuff, and it was one of those things that I think it was. I don't know if you ever had this experience, Tim, but have you ever said something and as soon as the phrase is coming out of your mouth, like you're instantly regretting it? Like it's so that was my I knew I was going to get some sort of feedback on that. And you were the one to take up that mantle. So you wrote a very kind email to me saying, "Hey, I enjoyed the show. However," and then we can proceed to fill in the blanks here through the course of our conversation. But the long story short is that the book on the token economies is not quite finished, and you're also kind enough to share a really nice paper, Token Reinforcement, Translational Research and Application, that you'd published in Java in 2018. And if you guys want to look that up, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I highly recommend reading it. So all that to say, it gave me a lot of food for thought, Tim. So thanks so much for sharing that with me. I want to dig into the paper, and I've got a lot of questions having to do with that, having to do with the practice of token economies more generally.
Let me just say, Matt, before we jump into that,
sure.
In your defense, this was not a topic that was the main focus of the show. It was a tangential conversation, and you did say that you were playing devil's advocate. So but whether or not you believed what you said about us knowing everything that we need to know about token economies, it did catch my attention. Because I have spent the better part of the last 2 decades up on a soapbox telling people that we don't know enough about why token economies work, why they sometimes don't work as well as we would like them to, and that we need to have a better understanding of the critical variables operating in token economy systems. And so that's why your remark sort of caught my attention. And I think though that it does go to a common misconception that maybe because we've just these are procedures that have been so widely utilized and successfully for the most part. Maybe we don't need any more research. Maybe we know all that we need to know. But my position is clearly that we're just scratching the surface, and these are complex systems that we need to know a lot more about in order to use them most effectively.
I appreciate your kind interpretation of again my flippant remark, but yeah, it was it's funny, it's one of those things where if you I don't know, this show will probably be like, I don't know, 210 or 215, somewhere in that range, and it's like you record enough of yourself over the over time. The law, just the law of large numbers would indicate you're going to say something that misses the mark. But so I'm grateful for the opportunity to get your perspective on this. And as much as I want to dive into that right away, I do want to get to know you a little bit better in terms of your background and have the listeners develop an appreciation if they're not familiar with you and your work. So let's start out how we always do on the show. Tell me a little bit about how you first encountered behavior analysis and what hooked you, what made you want to pursue that as a career, and feel free to kind of trace that up to what you're doing these days.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, when I look at my career in behavior analysis, I view it as a series of happy accidents. I grew up in Southern California kid, but was totally aimless as an undergraduate. I finished community college and I found myself at a small state school in Central California, Cal State Stanislaus. And I was lucky enough to encounter Jane Howard, who was a recently minted PhD from Western Michigan. And I took a class with her. And more importantly, I volunteered for an after-school direct instruction reading program. And I was completely blown away by the how behavioral principles in the hands of people who know what they're doing can lead to, incredible academic fluency. And so it was really through the applied realm that I got hooked into behavior analysis. From there, I developed an interest in some of the theoretical aspects of the field and started reading Skinner. There was another instructor there at the time, Dave Fossum, also a recent Western Michigan grad. And through conversations with Dave and Jane, I became just, incredibly passionate about behaviorism. And I was so naive at the time that I moved back to Southern California. I was, I was 20. I missed my Southern California lifestyle. Stanislaus is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And so I naively assumed that I could just go anywhere and there'd be a behavior analyst on the faculty, right? And so I moved back to Southern California, transferred to UC Irvine, and boy, was I wrong. UC Irvine at the time was just a bastion of cognitive science. This was in the, just at the beginnings of the so-called cognitive revolution. And they were not only non-behavioral, they were anti-behavioral. But happy accident number two, I was supporting myself through college, and I got a job at a group home for autistic adults that was run by some behavior analysts, also Western Michigan grads. All the behavioral programming was done, through with ABA principles, and so I really learned a lot about behavior management, about how to do behavioral programming, and so on with them. And through that, I became involved in the fledgling Cal ABA. It was still Southern California ABA at the time. And happy accident number three, the APA conference was in LA that year. And I attended the Division 25 program, the behavior analysis division. Had an outstanding program that year. Charlie Catania, Mark Branch, Joe Brady gave the presidential address, and I was just blown away. I still remember Joe Brady saying, behavior analysis is to the rest of psychology what astronomy is to astrology. And I was like, wow, this is for me. But I also met Phil Heinlein at that meeting, and Phil and I started up a correspondence, and I eventually went and studied with Phil at Temple University for graduate school. And I learned so much from Phil. I'd never worked in a lab before. As I mentioned, I learned everything that I knew through applied behavior analysis at that point. But I spent 5 years working with rats and pigeons and learning about basic research. And was fortunate enough to get a postdoc after that with Travis Thompson at the University of Minnesota. And Travis had just started an interdisciplinary institute called the Institute for Disability Studies. And Travis is just incredible at bringing together people from different fields to work on common problems. So I worked alongside people in special ed, neuroscientists, geneticists, behavior analysts, and Travis also had an active animal lab at the time. So I split my time between the lab, the animal lab, the human operant lab, and the state hospital, working on various problems related to applied behavior pharmacology, looking at the effects of drugs on learning and behavior problems. We did a project on opiate antagonists' effects on self-injurious behavior. But at the same time, I was working in the human operant lab, looking at self-control and instructional control. So it was just a glorious 2 years that I had in Minneapolis. And happy accident again. University of Florida was looking for a new faculty member at the time, and I applied and was fortunate enough to get that faculty job in 1990. And I moved from frozen tundra of Minnesota to Gainesville, Florida, and just had a wonderful time working amongst incredible colleagues and students. It was such a stimulating intellectual environment.
Can I interject here? How long were you at UF?
I was there until 2009, so 19 years.
I have had a number of Florida grads, probably more so than any other program on the show, either Florida grads or people who taught there, or in some cases both. So, can you comment? There must have been like just like a span of time, because so many amazing practitioners and scientists came out of that program. Certainly for decades, but there seemed to be this span of time in the 90s, and you got there right at that, as that curve started to ascend. Can you talk a little bit about what that must have been like? And I know you said it was kind of an intellectually stimulating environment, but like I don't want to go through a list of names because I would likely forget somebody, and I won't even take an offense. But you could just imagine the number of people who rolled through that program in that span of time, who just made amazing contributions. And I can only imagine what like not just what happened in the various laboratories or clinic type settings, but the types of conversations in informal settings like and so forth. Would you be able to comment on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I said, I feel incredibly fortunate to have joined the faculty at that time. It was as you mentioned, it was a real powerhouse of a program. The graduate students were incredibly bright and productive. There was this kind of sense of common purpose that ran through the program. So no matter what lab one was working in, what kind of research one was doing, there was there were fuzzy boundaries between the labs, the classes, the social activities. So often a graduate seminar would roll out into a bar after class, and the conversations would just continue, sometimes in a more animated way. So it was a fabulous time. I remember we had a weekly seminar. It was called 622. That was the course number, where everyone in the program attended. People would present research. Often graduate students would present whatever their current project was, and you can imagine, like, all of those great students, plus Brian Awada, Mark Branch, Hank Pennypacker, Ed Malagotti, somewhat later Tim Vollmer, Jesse Dallery, all being in the same room, having this free-ranging conversation about research and about concepts. It was a lovely time.
Now,
and personally,
go ahead.
Just as a junior faculty, I really appreciated the fact that that I could learn from these intellectual heavyweights in the field. That even though my formal mentorship was over, I, in a very real sense, continued to be mentored by the likes of Mark Branch and Hank Pennypacker and Ed Malagotti. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
I can only imagine being a graduate student, having to present your data and having people like Brian Awada and others that you mentioned, just kind of scratching their chin, looking at it pensively, and just deciding not if, but when, they're going to, provide some commentary on it. And I have to imagine that those graduates were well prepared to kind of go out and, do high quality work, because it had to survive that, that process. So anyway, yeah,
Absolutely.
we had a
Absolutely. It was a real proving ground. Yeah.
I can imagine we had a very similar, may possibly arguably shorter lived type of experience at when I was a grad student at Auburn University. We had it
Oh,
was
sure. Yeah.
it was in like the mid to late '90s, and it was just a great time. And I I think this is what you might have been getting at. A lot of the experimental students took clinical classes and vice versa. And what was interesting in that program is most of my friends who were in the clinical psych program are all research scientists at major universities, and most of us in the experimental program are in practice working with people in the community settings and things like that. It was just kind of a funny comment about and how it's so different today in terms of how people get trained in behavior analysis. So anyway, all that, yeah, I appreciate you kind of taking us down that little bit of a memory lane there, because I think it's important. I always like to, when I have the opportunity to do so, discuss that I consider these like little history, segments, if you will, of behavior analysis, because I think the field has grown so much and so quickly. I want listeners who are newer to the field to kind of gain an appreciation of kind of how we got here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you're not in Florida right now. You're actually 5 time zones away from me in England right now. So how did you wind up there?
That's right. Well, I'm semi-retired now. After UF, I took a position at Reed College, a small liberal arts college in Portland, Oregon, and I was just very, very fortunate to have an opportunity to teach at a small liberal arts college, where extremely small. The students were bright and motivated. The college made available resources for research and scholarship, and so I was able to maintain an active research program there, but to also experience a different side of academia. I loved every minute of my time at UF, but like many large state R1, research-oriented universities, it was moving increasingly toward the bottom line. The bringing in grant money in order to keep your lab alive, and filling seats with students, and so I was interested in kind of gaining experience with a different type of academic position, and Reed College was really a good fit for me, and so there, they appreciated if you brought in a grant, and I was able to continue getting grants, but the contingencies were different. It went from having to do it versus wanting to do it, and so I was able so I was able to experience this side of a different slice of academia, kind of at the other end of the continuum, and had a wonderful time there. I still have a grant running in Portland and at Reed College, so that's why I say I'm semi-retired. One of the nice things about the pandemic was I learned that you could do a lot of things remotely. And so I'm able to finish out my grant from 7,000 miles away, just by hiring good people on the ground and having frequent Zoom meetings like this to finish out that project. So I'm now, as you mentioned, living in the UK and enjoying my semi-retired status.
Hey everyone, just in case you missed it at the beginning of the show, I want to let you know that Rose Griffin's free masterclass, The Power of Joint Attention, is available at abaspeech.org. Just go to that website, abaspeech.org, and click the free class at the top. And it is a 30-minute class that will show you how to use things like songs and books in your therapy sessions to really effectively engage your learners. The course covers all sorts of things. It provides actionable tips that you can put into place in your very next therapy session. It also provides bonus printables that you can use right away. So again, to learn more, go to abaspeech.org and click the free masterclass tab. You can also go to the show notes for this episode and find the links there. All right, let's get back to this conversation with Tim. All right. Well, I know that we took a little bit of a rabbit hole journey there, but I appreciate the delving into that. For the reasons I mentioned, I just love hearing those stories. So, what I do want to do, however, is get to the paper, because this paper is, from my point of view, just an impressive work. It's a beast of a paper too. It took me like an hour and a half. It took me an embarrassingly long time to read it, so because it was so dense. There's so much there, but I really enjoyed it. So again, the paper's called "Token Reinforcement: Translational Research and Application." So let's start broadly here, Tim. What was the motivation for writing this review paper? What was the hole in the literature that you were trying to fill, especially given how, token economies have been written about for decades? So what were you trying to accomplish with this paper when you set out to write it up?
Well, it's a really good question. I think, I had my students and I, starting at UF, had embarked on this program of research on token reinforcement, mainly with pigeons in the operant lab, and doing beginning by replicating some of the classic studies that had been done with chimpanzees, with rats, but sort of bringing it more up to date and looking at it increasingly through a behavioral economic lens. The token reinforcement lends itself to this type of analysis quite well. And, I was also as we just discussed, in a community with applied behavior analysts who were well-versed in these types of token reinforcement procedures in the applied realm. And what became increasingly evident was the gap between the basic work on token reinforcement and the applied work on token reinforcement. And if you go back and study the literature, you see that the two realms have developed largely in parallel, with very little integration of concepts, of methods, very little cross-fertilization of ideas in the two realms. So the applied work on token economies, the classic work that goes back to the 1960s with Ione and Asrin's seminal work, and at Anna State Hospital with in an institution with psychotic adults, to the achievement place model at the University of Kansas with juveniles in a group home setting, to various classroom applications of token economies. There's very little mention of the basic research, and the basic research has proceeded really without very much acknowledgement of the application. And so it just seemed like we needed to find some way to bring these two realms together, because they're, as a result of the widespread success of token economies in applied settings. I think what has happened is that it has been so widely applied and disseminated so successfully that, going back to the beginning of our conversation, I think it may have created the impression that that we know everything we need to know about token economies.
Yeah, let me just step in here real quick, Tim, because there's so many great quotes from this paper, and one of them just kind of the first one is that it's right on the first page of the paper. Laboratory and applied work on token systems have developed largely in parallel with little cross-fertilization of ideas and concepts. You spoke to that a second ago, and then token, and you continue. Token reinforcement may be a victim of its own success. The effectiveness of token systems across such a range of settings and subject populations may have created a sense that further research is unnecessary. So, this is where I kind of stepped in it a little bit. So, let's get into that a little bit. So, what are some areas where you think that what do we need to know, or what questions still remain out there as it relates to both the laboratory setting, and of course, most listeners are going to be interested in their daily. Yeah, most listeners are practitioners, and therefore they're going to be interested more so in how this can help them help the people that they work with. But so let's take it from there. So where are these? Where do we need to learn more about these systems?
Well, I think, Matt, it might be helpful to sort of talk a little bit about what we mean by a token economy.
Yeah, that's a great start.
And the different components of a token economy, just to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page with respect to basic
Perfect.
terms and concepts. So, a token economy, all token economies, whether they're in a classroom, whether they're in an institution, whether they're in the laboratory, all token economies involve a system of interconnected contingencies, and they all involve at least three basic schedule components. Okay, I say at least three because these three can be embedded in larger institutional contingencies and so on. But all token systems involve three different component schedules. First is a schedule of token production. So this is a schedule by which tokens are earned. Second is a schedule of exchange production. This is the schedule on which exchange opportunities are made available. And the third is the token exchange. This is the schedule by which tokens are cashed in for terminal or backup reinforcers. Okay. And so it's important to recognize that each of these schedules is an independent schedule that can be manipulated on its own. Okay. But they're also interacting. And so you change one thing and it's going to necessarily alter other things. Okay, so it's important to recognize that a token economy is a system. It's an economic system, and if you alter one thing, it's often going to interact with other parts of the economy. So a token reinforcement schedule is a kind of chain schedule. So remember, a chain schedule is simply a schedule with two or more schedule components that are arranged sequentially. They're hooked together, one after the next. So in a token reinforcement schedule, you've got as I said, the token production schedule, the exchange production comes next, and then the token exchange. So they're arranged in sequence. You have to have one that happens before the other. You have to have tokens before you get to the exchange. You've got to have in order to exchange for backup reinforcers. But a token, so it's important to recognize, first of all, that it's a chain schedule, but it's a special kind of chain schedule where the amount of reinforcement during the exchange depends on the number of tokens that have been earned up to that point. Okay, so there's a direct positive correlation between the number of tokens and the amount of reinforcement available in the exchange. This is the way that token schedules are always studied in the lab. And they're sometimes studied this way, or they're sometimes arranged this way in applied teaching settings, but often not. Often tokens are used basically as a simple chain. So you get tokens, earn tokens, you satisfy some exchange production requirement. Let's say once you get 10 tokens, you fill up the token board, you exchange that for access to backup reinforcers. But the crucial part of what I'm calling a true token schedule is this positive correlation between the number of tokens and the amount of reinforcement. So if you have more tokens, if you have 10 tokens, then you get 10 units of reinforcement. If you instead run this just as a single reinforcer at the end, then it turns it into just a simple chain where the tokens denote completion of the chain, but you've only got one reinforcer at the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a number of different variables you can play with here.
Absolutely. And so one recommendation is to, whenever possible, use a true token schedule, because this really captures one of the essential features of a token reinforcement. That is the relationship between the number of tokens and the magnitude of the reinforcer. So in experiments we've done with pigeons, we found that if you compare the true token schedule to a simple chain, you get much higher rates of responding on a true token schedule, owing to the bigger reinforcer magnitude. And so if you run it just as a simple chain, then it might work, but it may not work as well in sustaining responding over long periods of time as a true token schedule.
I see. One of the questions I wanted to ask, I want to get back to that because I have some, I think, other questions in that regard. But before we go any further, what do we know about what works for establishing tokens as reinforcers, as condition reinforcers in the first place? Both from what you could surmise from the basic and applied literatures.
That's a great question.
Yeah, it's probably an impossibly broad. I think probably like a whole graduate seminar on just that. So maybe we feel free to localize that answer to as you see fit.
Well, what I might do is back up a couple of steps and talk first about how the tokens function within the economy as a whole before we talk about how to establish the reinforcing functions of the token. So once you recognize that a token schedule is a kind of chain schedule, what we know about chain schedules is that behavior is strongest where the action is, right? In the final link of the chain. And so using what we know about backward chaining methods, my recommendation would be to start with the exchange response. This is the terminal link in the chain, if you will. And then work backwards through the earlier links, through the token, the exchange production, token production links of the chain. So our recommendation. I should mention also that Francesca Daly Espinosa and I just put together a workshop that is designed to bridge the gap between the research on token reinforcement and practical implementation of evidence-based guidelines for implementing token economies most effectively. And one of the points that we really hammer home is the importance of beginning with establishing the exchange response. And this follows from an analysis of chain schedules. So you start where the behavior is the strongest. In this case, the exchange response let's say, for example, you're using a token board where there are, say, 10 tokens that have to be earned before the exchange opportunity is made available. So using backward chaining methods, we would fill up the token board and just establish the exchange response of handing over the token board. That is the exchange response for access to the backup reinforcers. Okay. Once that has established, then the idea is to work backwards and have 9 tokens on the board and require some response then to produce that 10th token. Maybe just giving the learner the token to place in that final position. And that is our recommendation for establishing the token as a conditioned reinforcer, is to embed it within this 3-term contingency. So the exchange response is established as a discriminated operant first, and then the tokens are brought into play that build on that exchange response.
Everyone, I want to take another quick break and thank a sponsor, and this sponsor is Behavior University. And their mission is to provide university quality instruction for the busy practitioner. They've got CEU offerings, they've got live webinars, they've got pre-recorded things, they've got special series, they've got all sorts of really cool and very different titles, if you will. One of them looking at right here, ASD and the Criminal Justice System, Preventing Contact, Improving Outcomes. And that looks really, really fascinating. I think I'm going to look into that one. And they've got a whole host of other things as well. And so if you are looking for a supervision course, if you are looking for RBT trainings and just about anything else in between, go to behavioruniversity.com/observations to check out the discounts that are available for podcast listeners. Again, that's behavioruniversity.com/observations and see what they have to offer. All right, let's get back to the rest of this conversation with Tim. Yeah, and it sounds like it makes the board itself a reinforcer as well. I want to let people know also, I will have a link to that course in the show notes. So I would highly recommend checking that out. You can go to behavioralobservations.com and look for this particular episode, or you could just sign up for the email list and the show notes will get automatically sent to you a couple of days after this show goes live. Have you ever looked at, I've seen people do this in practice where, maybe I'm fast forwarding here a little bit, but let's say tokens are established as reinforcers, and you have like a token strip with, say, 10 tokens on it. Seems like that people like large round numbers, looking at having 10 tokens on the board to start with, and then with each response you want to reinforce, you remove the token, so it's token removal signals progress towards the goal of getting the backup reinforcer. Is that something that you've seen looked at in any type of research? I've seen people do it in practice.
The answer is no. I'm not that familiar with that particular method. My guess is that it would not necessarily produce any different effects unless the teacher is the one removing the tokens, because there does seem to be some extra benefit to having the learner handle the token and place it on the board. Mm-hmm. And this just follows from the tokens being established as conditioned reinforcers. And so there's something about that handling and placement on the board that I think contributes to the reinforcing value of the completing the exchange, the exchange production requirement.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Like I said, I've seen people play with these things in numerous ways. So I was just curious if there was anything available to looking at it, the token removal as a some sort of I guess negative reinforcer type of configuration. All right, so back to the article itself. So that sounds like a great idea for establishing tokens as reinforcers to focus on the exchange response first and work backwards from there. One of the interesting things in the paper that I found noteworthy here is that you devoted a chunk of space to discussing in animal studies that showing a preference for generalized reinforcement. So I found that really interesting. I wonder if you can maybe take a step back and kind of describe what that observation is and what are maybe some applied implications of that.
Yes, happy to. So let's first talk about the concept of generalized reinforcement. As most people probably remember from coursework, generalized reinforcer is a type of conditioned reinforcer that derives its value through its relationship to two or more backup reinforcers. Okay, so the concept dates back to Skinner, Science and Human Behavior in 1953, first introduced this concept. And according to Skinner, generalized reinforcers should be stronger and more durable than specific type reinforcers. And the way Skinner put it was that because the momentary conditions of the organism are less important. And I think what he's getting at there is that with a specific type reinforcer, if you have a conditioned reinforcer that can only be exchanged for one thing, then the value of that conditioned reinforcer is going to rise and fall with the motivating operations surrounding that one thing that it can be exchanged for. But if you have a generalized reinforcer, the best example being money, then the momentary conditions of the organism are less important, meaning that that reinforcer is going to hold its value across a much wider range of conditions. Because when you get the paycheck at the end of the week, it's still going to be reinforcing, even if you're not hungry. You can use it to buy food, but it's going to be valuable. Even if you're not hungry, because you can cash it in for a wide range of reinforcing activities and events. So, when we think about conditioned reinforcement in our everyday lives, almost all of the conditioned reinforcers are generalized. Skinner also talked about how social reinforcers are also generalized reinforcers. Something like signs of attention are generalized reinforcers because they signal when other reinforcers are going to be made available. So eye contact, signs of approval, things like that are also generalized reinforcers. So when you think about money, when you think about social reinforcers, almost all conditioned reinforcers in everyday human life are generalized reinforcers. Now, when we look then at the basic research on generalized reinforcement, it has not been demonstrated. I mean, it is one of those things that the extrapolation of conditioned reinforcement to everyday human affairs from the laboratory is based almost exclusively on specific type conditioned reinforcers, a light or a tone that is associated with food, something like that. So when we started our research on token reinforcement, we always had in view the possibility of studying generalized reinforcement. That was, to us, that was the holy grail of studying token reinforcement, is developing methods to establish generalized reinforcing functions. And so we've done this in a number of ways. But mainly what we've done is we've taken specific tokens that can be exchanged, let's say, for food, let's say a green token can be exchanged for food. So over time and lots of experience, the pigeon comes to understand that the green token means food. Red token can be exchanged for water. And a third type, which we call the generalized token, a white token, can be exchanged for either food or water. So then we look at the conditions under which that generalized token might acquire, higher reinforcing value than the specific type tokens. And so, as I said, we've done this in a number of ways. One experiment that I think I might have been referring to in the paper is one where pigeons are given choices between specific type tokens and generalized tokens. So there are three important choices. One is between specific food and specific water, generalized versus specific food, and generalized versus specific water. And so under normal conditions, our pigeons would produce about 80% food tokens and 20% water tokens. Okay, so given the choice between the specific food, specific water, they would allocate their choices roughly that way. And I should say that these were experiments that were done in a closed economy, meaning that all of the animals' daily food and water intake occurred during the session. So these were long sessions. They had plenty of opportunity to earn all of their daily food and water there. And then the interesting thing was when we would provide the generalized token in a choice with the food token. Okay, so now water was needed. They would produce the generalized token and exchange it for water. And when we would reverse it, and now the water token is made available with the generalized, they would produce the generalized and exchange it for food. Okay. And so basically they maintain that same 80 to 20 food versus water, but they did it by using the generalized token to exchange for whatever wasn't available. Okay. So and this is where some of the economic concepts come into play. The generalized tokens served as functional substitutes for whatever token wasn't available. So when the food was not available, they would use it basically as a proxy for food. When the water was not available, they would use it as a proxy for water. And this is one of the reasons we think that generalized reinforcers are so valuable, because they serve as functional substitutes. They literally stand in for other reinforcers. So something like money is such a powerful generalized reinforcer because it's a proxy. It basically stands in for a wide range of other reinforcers. And that's what we were able to show.
Or if you're or an iPad,
or an iPad, yes.
There was a funny slide. Willie DeLeon came to New Hampshire ABA a few years ago and was talking about preference assessment in the context of behavioral economics. And he basically put up a slide of just an iPad. He's like, "Well, we've figured out preference assessments."
Yes, exactly. But what I would just follow up, unless you had some other follow up question, Matt. What I would say about this is that I feel like we've made some progress in the basic lab, and we've done sort of the obvious experiments, but here is where work in an applied setting, I think, is better suited to push the science forward, because we are limited in the number of backup reinforcers we can use with a pigeon. We've used food and water. One can imagine maybe using access to sexual activity or access to a drug to sort of, make the reinforcer a bit more generalized. But when we're dealing with humans in a token economy, the backup reinforcers are virtually unlimited. Okay, and so this puts us in a much better position to really delve in and understand and to quantify the generalizability of the reinforcer. So the way that I look at it is that the generalized reinforcers exist on a continuum. From on one end, very specific type reinforcers where you've got a token that can be exchanged for only one backup reinforcer, to the other side, like money, where you've got something that can be exchanged for a wide variety of backup reinforcers. But we know virtually nothing about the middle part of that continuum. And there are all kinds of like basic science questions, like is it a continuous function? Like, is the more reinforcers the better? Does it make it more generalized? Or is it more like a step function? Once you get beyond a certain point, then additional backup reinforcers don't really give you that much incremental value. So here's where and I'm serious about this. I've said this many times in presentations and in print, that the applied token economies are laboratories for studying basic processes. So there's a lot of scientific utility here in just studying generalized reinforcement in the context of an applied token economy. But of course, there are real practical applied implications as well, because the more generalized the reinforcer, the more valuable your tokens are, the more you're going to get the most out of your token economy. The more behavior you're going to be able to generate and sustain.
Everyone, one last quick message here. I want to let you know that balancing work and life can be difficult, and that's why the University of Cincinnati Online designed a Master's of Education in Behavior Analysis program that is 100% online and asynchronous, meaning you log on when it works for you. Their student success coordinators will work with you from start all the way to finish to ensure you are receiving the support you need. Graduate in as few as 5 semesters from a top 10 program in total number of graduates and prepare for the BCBA exam. The program is FAFSA eligible, and UC also offers a business partnership program to offer tuition discounts to eligible employees. If you want to learn more, go to online.uc.edu and click the request info button. I got it. Yeah, that's a great point. I want to get into some ideas you might have as far as experimental questions for students of behavior analysis who might be in thesis and dissertation mode right now. But before we get to that, there's a couple other things I want to cover first. So there was a really fascinating section of the paper where you talk about the token loss or other types of aversive, I guess you could say, formulations as it relates to the use of token economies. And with respect to kind of response to contingent token loss or other types of scenarios like this, what do we know about that aspect of using token economies? I think, again, I'm just basing it off of my observations as but most of the token economies that I've seen run don't necessarily have a token loss component to them. Obviously, I think people are very sensitive and perhaps in some cases are because of that reluctant to use any type of token fine, if you will, or anything things along those lines. So I'd like to know what do we know about that, and are we perhaps overlooking something that could when used properly and in a sensitive way be of benefit to the client?
Okay, well, it's a great question. Let me take it in two parts. First, with what we know about token loss as an aversive event in the research. It's a very complicated topic conceptually, in part because punishment is involves at least two different contingencies. You have the punishment contingency, but you also have this overlaid on top of the positive reinforcement contingency. There has to be some schedule on which behavior is being maintained before you can study the effects of punishment on that behavior. So you have at least two different contingencies and their interaction. So this is true of any punishment contingency, whether you're using token loss, whether you're using timeout, whether you're using electric shock. But what makes it particularly complicated in the case of token loss is that, by definition, the loss of a token means a reduction in the overall rate of reinforcement. You're basically taking away a token, and that means that you get less reinforcement during the exchange. And so even if you get a reduction in responding, it's often difficult to know whether that's due to the punishment by the removal of the token per se versus the overall reduction in the rate of reinforcement. So in the laboratory, we have developed these control procedures to try to disentangle those two effects by holding constant the overall rate of reinforcement and studying the punishment contingency by itself. It's complicated, but we have developed methods for doing so. And what we found is that response cost via token loss does suppress responding, on which it's contingent. This has been shown also in applied research with token loss, and so we know that it works. The second question the second part of your question is a bit trickier, and that is if and when to use it in an applied context. I'm reluctant to make any specific recommendations about this. I'm not a clinician. And because it's so complicated, it really depends on the specific response that you're trying to punish, whether it's challenging behavior, whether it's incorrect responses on an academic task. The recommendations that Francesca and I make in the workshop are based exclusively on positive reinforcement, on using token economies in a positive reinforcement manner, and we make it clear that token economies don't work for everything. Okay, they're extremely effective for developing academic tasks, for teaching conditional discriminations, for teaching verbal responding, and so on. But we don't recommend them for dealing with challenging behavior. Our field has well-developed methods for dealing with challenging behavior through functional assessment and replacement of the challenging behavior with more suitable alternatives and so on. So we don't recommend using token economies for that purpose. And so our recommendations are pretty much exclusively on the use of positive reinforcement. But I should say that to answer your question, response cost via token loss does work. But that's separate from the particular clinical recommendations.
So it might be fall into that category is just because you can doesn't mean you should, perhaps.
Yes.
It did. If I recall correctly, there was a section talking about how they some in some of the studies that some of the participants showed a preference for scenarios where token loss was part of an overall multi-component treatment package. So that was kind of interesting too, and it reminded me of some of the work in the good behavior game. Where I don't know if you're familiar with that that literature, but basically the teacher essentially assigns points when individuals when team members engage in disruptive behavior in classroom settings. And so there is almost a quasi punitive aspect to that. And my understanding is that when given the opportunity to choose between different iterations of the good behavior game that are both, just fully positive or in the standard, preparation for it, that individuals, generally speaking, prefer the standard or the traditional good behavior game arrangement. In other words, there's some preference for a situation or a treatment intervention where there's, what could be argued some aversive component to it. And I think there's also the paper that you cited in your paper, and that Matt and I talked about in our podcast. It was a very brief study with only a couple of participants. I think it was a Hanley paper back from the mid 2000s where there, and again, there was I can't remember if it was a token loss or there was some sort of aversive component to embedded with, again, in a much larger intervention where individuals showed a preference for a treatment package that had that sort of component to it. So it's an interesting, and again, I'm not trying to make the pro aversive argument here. So that to get me wrong, I'm just kind of, I guess, generally curious about how these things work as in a general science context.
No, it's an excellent point, and I you're right. I do cite at least one paper in the review that shows that response cost procedures are equally effective and in some cases preferred over straight up positive reinforcement methods in a token economy. So so you're absolutely right that, and at some point that is, it's not the only deciding factor, but it should be an important factor in giving the client choice and an autonomy on what situation they prefer.
Yeah. All right. So I think the last section of the kind of final pages of the paper talks a lot about the behavioral economic literature. Behavioral economics was huge when I was at the time, especially when I was like an undergraduate going into graduate school. It was really the heyday, I suppose, or at least just from my perspective. Perhaps others might have a different point of view on this, but that, like mid to late 90s, there was a lot of energy being poured, a lot of people making a lot of really interesting discoveries in the behavioral economics world. So I have a soft spot anytime that someone brings that up. It's certainly near and dear to me, and especially at Auburn. A lot of my friends who were there, did thesis and dissertation work in that area, and we had a lot of Howard Racklin came to visit Auburn once. We got to see him talk. So all that to say that I find that this general topic really, really fascinating. And then, and as you indicated earlier, the use of tokens lends itself very well to these types of economic analyses. We could spend multiple podcasts going into the various intricacies of behavioral economics. We have done shows on behavioral economics before, and if you're interested, the one that I would start with for folks who do want to get a background on this is session 17 with Derek Reed, and Derek's been back on the show. I'm sorry.
I've heard that episode.
Yeah. Derek's great, and really does not only is the information great, but he communicates these concepts very, very naturally in a way that allows people to grasp them. So yeah, I would start with session 17, but we've done a number of behavioral economics shows. So I'm not asking you to do behavioral economics 101, but what I would say is that relative to the points you're trying to make in the paper, if there's a few key behavioral economic terms as it relates to token reinforcement that would help practitioners, I want to give you the opportunity to share them here.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's a difficult question in part because behavioral economics has come to mean so many different things. And so the part of behavioral economics that I think is is most relevant to token economies is just the basic understanding, as I alluded to before, of token economies as an economic system. I mean, it's part of the term token economy.
Right.
It's an economic system of contingencies, and like the real economy, you change one thing and it can create this ripple throughout the rest of the economy. So, for example, I'm thinking of an old study from the 1970s on token economy, in which they altered the wage rate for a particular target response. I think it was toothbrushing. And so that went from earning 1 token to 5 tokens. So they increased the wages for toothbrushing. And what they didn't anticipate was how that additional income now produced by the higher wage would interact with other target responses that they were studying. So now that the client could earn more by toothbrushing, they could put more in the bank, and that reduced other socially adaptive target responses they were working toward. And so it actually had an increase on that target, but it decreased other behavior because now they had this additional income and they didn't have to work as hard to produce the tokens through other means.
That's the quintessential unintended consequence, right?
Exactly. But one of the things about, to me, one of the advantages of looking at things in a more economic way is that there's an explicit focus on not just a particular target response, but on the overall repertoire. So there's a real focus on the interaction between different responses in a repertoire. And so if you're only focused on the one thing, then you might miss these other collateral effects of token reinforcement contingency. So that's one sort of thing that I might say is just appreciate the fact that you're working within this system. As such, it's important to try to make the system as closed as possible. So I mentioned earlier the idea of a closed economy. And so if you're setting up a token economy or revising one that's already in place, my recommendation would be to try to make it as closed as possible. That is, so that all of the reinforcers and activities are included within the token economy. So you can't let's say, for example, if the iPad is a highly reinforcing activity, access to the iPad, it's going to be more effective in your token economy if it's not freely available outside of your token economy, right? So restricting access to those reinforcers so they're only available within that particular setting. Now, this is sometimes not feasible for practical reasons. You can't restrict a learner's favorite toy or activity across all environments. But there are creative ways to do this. There's a classic study by McLaughlin and Malaby from the 1970s. I talk about this in my review, where they took naturally occurring activities within the classroom setting, things like sharpening pencils, and this is a bit dated, right. Sharpening pencils, feeding the class hamster, taking out the balls for recess, things like that. And they simply restructured the normally occurring activities so that those reinforcers were made more productively contingent on academic behavior. So there was no extrinsic reinforcers that were available during the exchange. They were all things that were intrinsic to the classroom environment. And that's another way of closing the economy, because these were activities by definition that could only be done in that classroom environment. So that's another important recommendation, is to try to close the economy to the extent that it's possible, and to include all of your teaching programs within the token economy. So one thing that I sometimes hear is, well, we use a token economy for this skill, but not for this one. And the problem there is that the learner will quickly develop a discrimination between those tasks that are going to require tokens, and which also, they involve more work. You've got to earn multiple tokens before you get to the exchange. Delays to the exchange versus those that are where the reinforcers are directly contingent on responding. And so, again, it's going to be better if you can include all of your teaching programs within the token economy. And so if you're dealing with, let's say, an easy versus a hard task, what you might do is modify the schedules so that your hard task is, produces tokens on an FR1 or some very rich schedule, whereas the easier tasks are arranged so that they require more tokens to get to the exchange. It's going to be important, again, that this is related to the closed economy idea, that the more that you can include within your token economy, the more effective it's going to be.
I see. So just to go back to that paper, that's McLaughlin and Malaby, 1972. That's in the fifth volume of Java. So I'll include a link to that study in the show notes for sure. And so, Tim, one of the things I was going to ask you is, what should be on someone's checklist if they're using a token economy and they want to make sure it's being optimized. And I think you kind of answered that and what you just said there. So if I'm just kind of recap to make sure I'm understanding you correctly here. So it's kind of essentially close the economy as much as possible, have all learning programs on the token economy that you're running, and then maybe individualize the schedules of reinforcement based on the difficulty of the tasks. Do I have that correct? And and also, are there other things that you would add to that kind of checklist for the practitioner who's using a token economy and they want to make sure that their system is optimized?
Yes, thank you for that question. So going back to our earlier discussion, I would start with establishing that exchange response. That is the foundation, really, for the rest of the behavior you're trying to establish in the token economy. Start with the exchange response. Work backwards through backward chaining methods to establish the other parts of the chain. Another important consideration is with thinning the schedule. So you start with very rich schedules where maybe the token production schedule is an FR1, where each target response produces a token. The exchange production response is also very rich, where maybe only one or two tokens are needed to get to the exchange. But at some point, one of the advantages of using a token system is that you don't have to reinforce each and every response with a primary, with a backup reinforcer. You want to be able to thin the schedule in a way that allows you to get the most bang for your buck, the most teaching per reinforcement consumption time. You don't want to spend all day with a kid consuming the reinforcers, right? You want to maximize the teaching opportunities. And so an important consideration then is, how do you thin the schedules? Where do you start? With the token production schedule? With the exchange production schedule? Does it matter? Are these not just simply different ways of achieving the same ends? Well, it turns out it does matter. It matters a lot. We know from all kinds of research that the exchange production schedule, all else equal, produces much stronger effects than the token production schedule. And this follows from viewing a token schedule as a chain schedule. The exchange production links are closer to the exchange. they're going to generate stronger behavior than the token production schedule. So when you're wanting to thin the schedules, the recommendation is to thin the exchange production schedule first, requiring more and more tokens before you get to the exchange, rather than the token production schedule, rather than requiring more responses per token. Does that make sense?
Yeah, make sure I understand you correctly. So you're saying like give more tokens for the in the same amount of time, as opposed to stretch out the delivery of the tokens. Do I have that correct?
Almost. I would say.
All right, help me out here.
So let's just go back and review. You've got the token production schedule. This is, the number of let's just stick with ratio schedule. It's easiest to think about. The number of responses to produce a token, and then you have the number of tokens that's needed to get to the exchange. Okay, so let's stick with our example of 10 tokens on the board to get to the exchange. We'd call that an FR10, exchange production schedule, because you need 10 tokens to get to the exchange. So if you're starting with, let's say, an FR1 token production, one token produces the exchange period, it's going to be more advantageous to increase the number of tokens that's needed to get to the exchange, 2 tokens, 3 tokens, 4 tokens, up to 10 tokens, while keeping the token production requirements minimal at, say, FR1.
Okay.
Rather than the other way around, by increasing the number of responses that are needed to produce a single token. Even if the overall number of responses to get to the exchange is the same, because one of the advantages of changing the exchange production schedule is that each increment in that ratio is producing a corresponding increase in the amount of reinforcement in the exchange. Because each token, you're requiring more and more tokens to get to the exchange, but each one of those tokens is exchangeable for another unit of the backup reinforcer during the exchange. So thinking about this in behavioral economic terms, the unit price remains the same. And so when you're shopping in the grocery store, you're always looking to minimize the unit price, the number, the amount per unit of the commodity. And so one of the advantages of increasing the exchange production schedule is that you hold that unit price the same. You're requiring more and more tokens before you get to the exchange, but each one produces a corresponding increment in the amount of reinforcement available during the exchange period. Whereas if you increase the amount of the number of responses needed to produce each token, you're actually increasing the unit price. You're increasing the amount of work without the corresponding benefit of increased reinforcement during the exchange. So all of this is to say that when you are going to thin the schedules, start with the exchange production schedule. Keep the token production requirements small and increase the exchange production requirements. You're going to get more benefit that way. You're going to get more from your token economy.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/getCEs. That makes sense. So I know you gave some great examples earlier, some experimental questions that are still out there to be answered. I want to give you another opportunity if you have, and perhaps ask the question more directly. There are undoubtedly people listening to this show right now who are looking for dissertation and thesis topics. is there a really tight experimental question that are there some low hanging fruit out there that you'd recommend people look at and I'm thinking of people who are predominantly in clinical practice, again, who are very likely, looking for research topics for their thesis or dissertations?
Yeah, great question.
I love asking these questions to academics. Many. It's because it's like it's the easiest interview question ever.
Well, the difficulty is that there are just so many. It's such a wide open area, Matt. As I said before, I really view token economies as sort of applied laboratories for studying basic processes. So there's so many. One that comes to mind is looking at the fixed versus variable schedule. So one thing that we know from all the way back to Forster and Skinner in schedules of reinforcement is that organisms have a strong preference for variable over fixed schedules, even when they are of the same average value. Okay, so let's say if you set up a fixed ratio 5 responses are needed to produce a reinforcer. Compare that to a variable ratio 5, where an average of 5 responses are needed to produce a reinforcer. The VR schedule will produce much stronger rates of behavior and will be strongly preferred over the fixed schedule, even though the overall rate of reinforcement, let's say, is equivalent. This is such a well-established finding. It's been shown across a wide range of species, including people. It's been shown in token and non-token contexts. And so one of the teaching recommendations would be to, whenever possible, use a variable schedule. Okay, and that is true of the token production schedule. It's true especially of the exchange production schedule. We have found that the variable schedules generate much stronger behavior that's resistant to extinction, and it's much it's highly preferred over fixed schedules. Okay, so one question that comes to mind then is, that basic finding by itself just needs to be replicated. It needs to be elaborated and extended. There's beginning to be some research on the exchange production schedules and variable versus fixed. So that's starting to come into the literature, and I'm really pleased to see that. But one question that comes to mind is how general this is. It seems to be general. It seems to cut across different species and settings and populations. But when one is working with kids with autism, for example, one of the characteristics of autism seems to be this preference for regularity, preference for sameness, preference for fixed sort of outcomes. And so one question that comes to my mind is whether these kinds of variable exchange schedules would work as well with kids diagnosed with autism who have this kind of preference for things that are fixed and regular.
It's a very, very important question, and it's a question well suited to perhaps folks in the audience who are very likely working with individuals who have autism. So I appreciate that suggestion, and I can only imagine the amount of restraint you're applying here, because it sounds like, again, the experimental questions are limitless. So, all right, Tim, this has been just a really fun conversation. I always love the opportunity to intertwine the basic and applied aspects of what we do as behavior analysis, behavior analysts. So I want to give the opportunity is there any final thoughts as it relates to this topic? I want to give the opportunity to share those, or if you want to close us out here with some advice for the newly minted BCBA, we could do that as well. So I'll leave it up. I'll leave it up to you.
Okay. Well, first, just to close off the topic of token economies, I mean, we're just really we've only had an opportunity to scratch the surface here, and I think there's a real need for basic researchers, applied researchers, and practitioners to have a dialogue, to talk about common problems, to try to figure out how things work and how those can best be translated into practice. I just wanted to mention a paper that is going to be coming out in behavior analysis and practice by Natalie Fernandez and some of her colleagues at Kennedy Krieger, where they did a survey. This comes up repeatedly in the workshop, Francesca, in my workshop I mentioned earlier, that they did a survey of BCBAs on implementation of token economies, and what they found was wide variation in virtually every aspect of token economy implementation, from establishing tokens as reinforcers to the type of schedules that are used, the type of motivational operations that are used, and so on. And it's kind of it. I don't want to use the term crisis, but it's bordering on a crisis, because this is not an optimal state of affairs, obviously, for a mature applied science. The mark of a mature applied science is standardized technology that is based on principles that are derived from an analysis. And what this survey shows is that there's so much variation in the ways that token economies are implemented that vary from classroom to classroom, from clinic to clinic, and sometimes from learner to learner, that we really need to develop a set of standardized evidence-based recommendations. And that's what I would really like to see happen in the field of token economies, is to really open up a dialogue so that we have a clear, standardized set of methods that we know is optimized to function effectively based on what we know about token reinforcement. So that's my sort of take home. If you're working with a token system that doesn't seem to be working, don't give up on it, because often with just some subtle tweaking, with some relatively minor modifications, you can get the system to be working more effectively. So the challenge is not to give up, but to delve deeper into the reasons why it might not be working as effectively as it might, and trying to improve it.
That makes sense, and I look forward to that paper. That paper's in press, or it's not available yet?
It should be out soon.
Got it. Very good.
I saw it first as a conference presentation at ABAI, this last ABAI in Boston, and it's forthcoming in behavior analysis and practice.
I will definitely check that one out. All right. Any other advice that you have
for newly minted BCBAs?
Yeah.
I guess just in general, my advice would be to learn more about the subject, whatever it is that you're studying, whether it's educational practices, whether it's autism treatment. Learn more about what you're studying outside of behavior analysis. Behavior analysis gives us a rich and diverse set of tools to study particular kinds of problems. But there's a lot out there. There's a lot of smart people in the field that approach things from different points of view. And what I have learned in my career is that if you take off your behavior analysis hat and you listen to what other people have done and are doing, and learn how to communicate more effectively with people outside our field, it produces good outcomes. We need to be a little bit less doctrinaire. We need to be a little bit less technical and jargony, and to learn more about what people in other fields have to say about our subject.
All right. Those are wise words to end on. Tim, this has been a delightful conversation. I can't thank you enough for reaching out and prompting this conversation. So, and I will direct people towards that webinar that you and Francesca put together. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.